There is a lie that people tell themselves about evil. They imagine it wears a monster's face, that it announces itself, and that when the time comes, you'll know exactly where it stands and who must be fought. But real evil rarely works that way. It hides behind business deals, behind family names, behind people who smile while poisoning entire neighborhoods. People who never swing a sword themselves. People who never have to. Because someone else always pays the price. A child, a family, a city. Sometimes the guilty suffer, but more often the innocent suffer first. And by the time you realize what's happening, the damage is already done. The fires have already been lit, and all that's left is deciding how much you're willing to sacrifice to put them out. This is Together Again, and welcome to Episode 6, A Cran Family Affair. When the Lord and Lady of Castle Shard told us the elder brother of Torriden Cran, Linnech, was running an operation in Rivergate, we felt we had to pick up where we left off with that family. If Castle Shard was able to figure out so easily that we had been behind the fall of the younger Cran, it would be possible his elder brother, who was at the helm of a larger and more lucrative operation, was likely to find a connection to us sooner or later and come for us himself. However, if he were to meet with some misfortune before that could happen, we would be free of that concern. Of course, the lords of Castle Shard wanted us simply to get eyes on this gold statue, or whatever it was, but we felt there may be something extra in it, just for us. We began by scouting out the rumors of the senior Cran wanting to hire outside help with something. We confirmed the basic information first. This Cran was indeed some sort of crime boss operating out of Rivergate. Depending on who you asked, he was into everything from protection rackets to drugs, prostitution, petty theft, and everything else people assume crime organizations do. The short answer was they were generally up to no good. One likely rumor that we're going to have to keep in consideration is that it seems that there's some sort of coordination between Linnech Cran's organization and the Balcazar crime family, the largest and most dangerous crime organization in Ptolus. If that's true, we're going to have our work cut out for us. In Rivergate, we found a bar called Nadar's Pub, where one of the Cran's toadies was posted up like an overinflated rooster. We settled down to see what we could overhear. We had discussed our strategy beforehand and arrived in ones and twos, spreading out throughout the establishment. The tavern itself was exactly what you'd expect from a place frequented by criminals and the people who wanted to do business with him. Nobody seemed relaxed. Nobody laughed too loudly. Everyone watched everyone else without appearing to do so. The sort of place where trouble could start over a careless word, and usually did. It wasn't long before a nervous-looking fellow named Enos Runderdorf showed up with the telltale blue stains of shivel on his lips and fingers. He began begging to be allowed to speak to Cran about offering his services on the matter we had heard rumored. Shimmy, the aforementioned puffed-up rooster, turned him down hard. At the first sign of protest, a couple of bodyguards sitting around him began to stand, inspiring the man to retreat. Seeing this, Ruger saw an opportunity. He made his way over to the bar where Enos had gone. I saw him slide up beside the nervous man and began conversing with him. Soon he was ordering food and drink for them and chatting with the fellow like they were old friends, though the man was obviously experiencing withdrawal symptoms that we had seen in others bearing the blue lips and fingers. During their chat, Ruger learned the man's name and that he was desperate to earn some coin. He explained that the man he was trying to speak to was named Shimmy, and he worked for a powerful man named Linnech Cran, who was rumored to be looking for people who could work discreetly. I'm not sure what Ruger said next, but it made Enos go wide-eyed and hurry out of the tavern. Ruger grabbed his mug and approached Shimmy's table with a noticeable swagger. The man had been watching the two talking at the bar with a look on his face that appeared to be a combination of smugness and irritation. It was as if he knew Ruger would want to talk with him, was irritated about the interruption to come, but was also looking forward to telling the dwarf to go kick rocks. I was close enough to hear Ruger greet the man and tell him that he had heard his boss was looking for skilled labor. Shimmy, to no surprise, immediately dismissed Ruger, saying he didn't need anything from a stinking dwarf. Ruger pulled up a chair and sat down. Predictably, the two bodyguards began to stand. Everything in the tavern went silent. Eyes shifted toward the scene about to unfold. Just as the gloating smile began to form on Shimmy's face, both he and his bodyguards noticed us, rising from our seats at tables, surrounding theirs, and casually resting our hands on the handles of our weapons, with an ease that spoke of familiarity with their use. The fool had assumed Ruger was a lone, incompetent dwarf, until he saw he was part of a group, competent enough to infiltrate and surround him and his guards without them even knowing it. Shimmy tried to make it appear as if he knew he and his men were surrounded the whole time, that he was merely allowing us to perform for his approval. The man isn't a very good liar. Still, that got us the audience we were looking for. Meeting Linnech Cran. The bantam rooster of a man regained his composure when he saw we were looking for work and not trouble. Much of his swagger returned, and we got the impression that he thought he owned the place. I was more worried about one of the guards doing something stupid. Sometimes when people like this have their incompetence exposed, they can lash out in an attempt to validate themselves. Thankfully, they seem to know that drawing steel on a group that not only got the jump on them, but also outnumbered them 5-2 was not a good idea. We followed Shimmy to a large compound at the back end of Rivergate, surrounded by a high wooden wall separating it from the surrounding neighborhood. I thought this seemed a little out of place, considering the area was far more affluent than our usual haunts. I would expect this in the Warrens or the docks, but not Rivergate. We passed through a sturdy double gate, guarded by a pair of guards that looked like they would rather be anywhere but posted at that gate. I noted a stout length of wood that could be used to bar the sturdy doors. The inside of the compound was tidy, with worn paths leading from building to building, and a central fountain that acted as a centerpiece. I'm sure we were all trying to develop a mental map of the compound's layout, and I scanned back and forth, taking it all in. Immediately to the right was what appeared to be a residence, and a couple of buildings to the left looked more like a stable and maybe some sort of storeroom. We were led past those buildings, and I noted several more beyond the fountain toward the back end of the compound, though it was too dark to make out much of anything. Before we got as far as the fountain, we were led onto a path heading to the left toward a large, plain wooden structure with a railed porch containing benches and chairs. As we entered, it appeared to be the common room or small alehouse. There were some men who looked to be guards drinking at a table, and a couple of them looked up as we entered. Among them was a human woman who was passed out with her eyes rolled back in her head. It was hard to miss the blue stains around her nose and on her fingers. One of the guards nodded at Shimmy. "What do we have here?" he asked. He indicated our way and that he had found some people who might be able to help with Mr. Cran's issue. The guard turned to another younger man and told him to help Miss Biesta get home. The younger man began struggling to pull the limp woman out of her chair, and time seemed to slow down as he half carried, half dragged her out of the door. We later discovered that this woman was on shivel and turned out to be none other than Biesta Cran, Linnech's little sister. With that unpleasant business concluded, we were soon escorted into a side room that looked to be an office to meet Cran and hear his mysterious request for aid from outside his own organization. The room would have been spacious if it were not for all the people crowded within. We were crowded around the entrance with seats to the sides flanking a large, ornately carved desk. Lounging in the seats, we were introduced to Cran's inner circle. To the left was a dwarven warrior named Ruor, in well-maintained armor with a wicked-looking axe. Next to him was a halfling in plain clothes with no obvious weaponry named Shanus. To the right, taking up an entire couch, was a heavily tattooed woman with eastern features named Bird. Finally, before us, seated behind the desk, was a well-dressed half-orc with familiar features. He was not as powerfully built as his younger brother, but it was clear that he was in charge, and he was a Cran. These were all clearly dangerous people, and it was hard for me to look away. But there was another thing in this office that demanded attention. In the corner of the office, directly to our right, stood a man-sized golden statue of a human man dressed in fine adventuring garb. If that wasn't what Castle Shard wanted us to locate, I didn't know what could be. There was a bit of posturing initially. Bird was making a point of taking up the entire couch and refused to relinquish her spot on one of the few places to sit. Additionally, Ruor felt it necessary to out-dwarf Ruger, but to his credit, it didn't take Linnech long to rein in his people. They had respect for him, and before long, civility had returned to the room. With a meaningful sigh that somehow conveyed sadness and defeat, he began to tell us what he wanted us to do. 2 weeks ago, Linnech Cran lost his son. His body was being brought back on the White Wind Sea aboard a ship called the Arrowhead. The ship burned and sank in the harbor with his son's body on board. It was then we were called seeing a ship burning in the harbor a few nights past, but it wasn't very close to land, so it was merely a night's spectacle. He said that he wanted his son and the casket brought back to him as soon as possible. He said the casket was well built and stored in the hold, so it was likely still intact. He just needed someone to go retrieve it. Shimmy knew where it was anchored and could lead us to the area. They could not be certain of what happened because nobody saw what caused the arrowhead to burn. Cran didn't care about the other stuff on the ship. He only wanted his son returned. He described the casket as being roughly 300 pounds. It was made of laminac oak, and the sealed top was made of glass. If we were able to obtain the casket, we'd only have to reach Rivergate, and witnesses would be irrelevant. Seeing the fat purse he was offering, we decided to see where this job took us. Considering the location of the job, a few potions of water breathing were included in advance, and we successfully negotiated for a couple more, 6 in total. Each one we figured would last us an hour and aid us in our search through the shipwreck. The Arrowhead. The next day, after we had outfitted ourselves for an underwater operation, we went with Shimmy to the docks where we rented a barge and hired a pilot to get us to the site of the shipwreck. We downed the potions and slipped into the water to begin our search. The effect of the potions was very strange. You had to take water into your lungs, an action that normally leads to drowning. It was terrifying at first, but we adjusted quickly. Ruger did most of the heavy lifting once we were in the water. He had recently come into possession of a cloak of the manta we had looted from under the Grayson house, and he used the mobility it provided to scout the area of the shipwreck. It took a little while because the wreck drifted a little when it sank, but eventually we found it. The news wasn't all good though. The shipwreck had already been claimed by sahaugin, and many of them were riding sharks. Ruger used the cloak to draw off a patrol while we stealthily approached to attack those that stayed behind. We had a brief skirmish and killed the guards, then prepared for Ruger to bring the patrol back around to our ambush. We targeted the sharks first, the way a spear wall takes the horses out from under the knights riding them. Without having to worry about those rows of teeth, we were able to put the rest of the sahaugin to the spear. Once the wreck was secured, we moved inside to search for the casket, but what we found stunned us. Nearly the entire cargo was shivel, but there was no sign of the coffin. We surfaced a little disappointed and reported our findings, thinking we had failed. However, Shimmy indicated that he thought he knew where to look next. He directed the pilot to take us to a cave in the cliff south of the Warrens. We worked along the sheer, craggy cliff face toward a very specific point where a low opening could be seen. Shimmy indicated that at low tide a small boat could make it through the opening into the cave, where smuggled goods could be offloaded and taken up a set of stairs into the basement of a house. The tide was not low, so we had to return to the water, leaving the barge outside. Again, Ruger scouted ahead while we slowly made our way behind him. That cloak is worth more than its weight in gold if you find yourself in water. Fighting and moving underwater is so awkward, but this cloak had Ruger moving around quickly. Moving into the cave, we saw Ruger had already engaged more shark-riding sahaugin. Some, noting our entrance, moved in to attack us, and we were soon fighting for our lives again in an unfamiliar setting. I can't stress how much I detest fighting underwater. I brought a spear thinking the thrusting attacks would be easier in the water, but I prefer my sword. Thankfully, there were not many, and we were able to kill them fairly quickly and get ourselves up onto the beach, where we could see several small boats dragged up to the sand. There was a prominent opening in the cavern, and we began heading toward it. Working our way into the cavern, we heard sounds of battle from ahead and began finding the mangled bodies of human smugglers strewn across the path. When I say they were mangled, they had some very rough and savage wounds. These were not sword cuts. It looked like a wild beast with incredible strength tore these guys apart. Proceeding with caution, we continued deeper into the cavern. Linnech Cran. Proceeding with caution, we entered a chamber and located the coffin. It was empty, and the glass lid had been broken. Phelan was on a knee examining the glass. It was then he told us that the glass had apparently been smashed outward, as if something had come out from the inside. He said it was almost an inch thick, so whatever came out of that coffin was very strong. I shot a look at Gis, and he gave me a shrug that was not very comforting. I know we were praying to any deity that would listen for this to not come to some sort of powerful undead. All we would need is a vampire or a revenant showing up and tearing us apart. As we made our way down the passage, we found some of the survivors with their weapons out and wild looks in their eyes. We must have been a sight to behold, soaked with seawater and blood and bristling with weapons. It was obvious we did not belong there, and were not there to make friends. The surviving smugglers quickly turned their attention to us and put up quite a fight. Part of what made these smugglers difficult to handle was the fact that some of us were forced to leave weapons and armor ill-suited to aquatic combat behind. We all sustained injuries during the fight, so when a human slave named Sumar and a lizard man slave named Helson rose up to aid us in defeating the smugglers, we didn't complain. Once we had control of the basement, we began to question survivors about what the hell was down there in the far end of the basement. We also started to search, hoping for some clues as to what was going on. We weren't quite ready to find what came out of that coffin just yet. Concerned about the possibility of being attacked on two fronts, Ruger and I crept up the stairs to make sure there would be no additional threats coming from up there. We found the last of the smugglers, but between stealth and a little magic, and the element of surprise, they were bleeding out on the floor before they really knew what happened. Returning to the basement, we found that none of the survivors had any useful knowledge concerning whatever it was still lurking in the far end. Among the bodies, we found monetary notes from the Jade Crossroads, which is another lead we can follow up on, but that would be for a later day. Without any additional clues, we decided to see what the former slaves knew. Apparently, this smuggling operation was being run by the Balcazars. Being slaves, they didn't know much more than that, aside from the obvious. This place was the site of a smuggling operation that we had just upended. They were able to confirm one of our suspicions. The sahaugin were working with the smugglers to loot the sunken ship. We gave them some weapons and some coin and set them free. They gratefully took both and headed up the stairs to the first floor, not wanting to stick around while we investigated what was still in the basement with us. We waited for them to clear out before we got down to cutting throats. We couldn't have any surviving smugglers running off to tell their handlers about us. With the smugglers dealt with, we set out searching the place for what they had been fighting before we arrived. The basement wasn't that large, so it didn't take long. Huddled back in a dark end tunnel, we found the former occupant of the coffin, Linnech Cran. Contrary to the rumor, he wasn't quite dead. He was young, not yet in his teens, wearing what were once fine clothes but were now torn and covered in blood. His mixed heritage was apparent, and from the looks of it, his mother was human. He cowered, mumbling to himself as he feverishly rocked back and forth on his heels. It was hard to believe that this is what broke out of the sturdy coffin, that this was what had torn grown men apart without a weapon to be seen. And when he looked up, we could see he had deep slashes in his face, but they were not bleeding, they were older. We began to speak with him in a calm and soothing tone. We still weren't sure what exactly was going on, but he seemed like a scared little boy rather than a monster. And just when we seemed to be making progress, and he began to calm down, his demeanor completely changed, and he hissed promises of death and torture to us through clenched teeth in a malevolent, otherworldly voice. This kid was possessed. The entity tried to lash out, but Lionel fought with all his will to keep it in check while he begged us to flee. He didn't think he could hold the entity for long, and he did not want to see us end up like his other victims. His tearful gaze shifted to me and held me down like an anchor. I saw suffering no child should experience in those eyes. I saw a plea for help he dared not speak because he knew he would be our doom. I didn't know how, but I knew we had to help him. We tried to soothe him, assuring him we were his friends and only wanted to help, but this was having little effect. Just as it seemed his control was about to slip, I became aware of soothing music being played. It began with subtlety. I didn't notice exactly when it began, but I could feel the tension in the room dissipating as the song established itself. I didn't need to look to know Tyrick was working his bardic magic. The struggle in Lionel's face began to wane as whatever was fighting for control was pacified. Soon he entered some sort of altered state of consciousness. His eyes partially rolled back in his head. His breathing was shallow and ragged. Though the entity seemed to have fled for the moment, those strange wounds persisted. There were deep cuts and nasty abrasions, but there was no blood whatsoever. It was all unnatural. Most of his once fine clothes were torn and cut from the smugglers' attacks, and I noticed something that made me pause. He bore a mark, very similar to the one Rena has. Like Rena's mark, it looked similar to a dwarven rune, but a little off. It was a vertical line with a couple of shorter lines angling up and to the right. This kid was Runeborn. I looked around, and it was clear I wasn't the only person that noticed. Another thing we saw that seemed strange was that Lionel was tightly clutching a pocket watch, even in his semi-conscious state. It seemed very important to him, so we let him hold on to it. Between that and the fact that he was possessed, we felt a bit out of our depth. We knew he needed help we could not give. We knew the Knights of the Golden Cross had powerful priests and wizards among their number, and could probably call on the aid of others if needed. So we decided to ask them for help. However, we also needed to report back to Castle Shard. Though our job was technically done, we had a feeling that when they learned what we had found, they would have more work for us to do. Return to Castle Shard. We decided the best way to proceed would be to split up so we could get Lionel help as soon as possible while keeping the ball rolling with our employer. We used minor magics to clean ourselves up enough to hire a coach without alarming the driver. We wanted to keep Lionel out of sight when we were transporting him, and it was also a good idea to keep a low profile ourselves. Tyrek would go with Lionel since he was able to keep the thing possessing him in some type of control. Phelan would use his speed to give the Knights of the Golden Cross notice that they were about to receive an unusual guest with an unusual problem. On the way, we paused at my house to pick up Rena. Then we raced back to the Knights of the Golden Cross, hoping their cleric or wizard could do something to help. They took him in and we left Rena with them as well until we could resolve a few things. With Lionel and Rena safely with the Knights of the Golden Cross, Phelan, Gisselfried, and I headed over to Castle Shard. Ruger took off to the Cran compound to tell Linnech what we had found. Well, some of what we had found. He thought if we played this right, we could sweeten the deal with Cran, do some preemptive scouting, and set ourselves up to squeeze as much as we could out of him before we returned to put him down. When we got to Castle Shard, Cadmus received us as if we had been expected.
Welcome.
We were soon escorted to the office where we last spoke to the lords of Castle Shard, where we found Lord Xavier and Lady Rill waiting. As before, Xavier was present and interested, but Rill was by all appearances there in body alone. Call it my immature protest, but when we gave them the rundown of what happened, I turned my back on Rill and ignored the fact that she was there. That was why it shocked me when she finally spoke. We had been telling them about Cran's dead son, who was stored in the hold of the Arrowhead, when Rill told Xavier he should tell us about the role he had to play in those events. I looked at her, and she still appeared as if she was far away, but she was definitely part of this conversation. Xavier looked distraught. In a somber tone, he told us that he had found the island upon which Linnech Cran had established facilities to produce shivel. He had launched an attack on the island to destroy those facilities, and was very disturbed to learn that Lionel Cran was probably a victim of that attack. We continued our tale, telling him that Lionel wasn't quite dead, which seemed to satisfy him without inspiring any uncomfortable questions. He paid us the agreed upon amount, and as we predicted, immediately offered us another job. It was the assignment we had anticipated. He wanted us to secure the golden statue and bring it to Castle Shard. What we didn't predict was the price. He only offered 2,500 gold thrones for a man-sized golden statue. It became obvious they weren't telling us the whole story. When I argued that we could probably get more money by melting it down and selling the gold, they were forced to tell us what was really going on, or at least part of the story. The statue was more than a mere chunk of gold formed into the likeness of a person. They specifically asked that we not damage it. The statue was linked to House Abercombe, which was never a major noble house. The last member of that house was Gregory Abercombe, who disappeared roughly 50 years ago while delving beneath the city. When Gregory vanished, House Abercombe effectively ceased to exist. Xavier explained that Gregory had been his friend, and that he believed Gregory had not died. Instead, he believed he had somehow been transformed into the golden statue. That made considerably more sense. We acknowledged there could still be more to the story, but the prospect of having both Castle Shard and a potentially reinstated House Abercombe in our debt made a 2,500 gold throne price tag seem more than reasonable. Between the additional information Lord Zavir reluctantly shared and the fact that we were already planning to raid the compound, it made sense to get paid a little more while doing it. So we agreed to secure the statue. Seeing that Lord Zavir seemed willing to share some of the history of Ptolus with us, we directly asked what he knew about Runeborn. Apparently, they have a long history tied to the city itself. He said that it was thought that Eslathagos Malkeith, the Dread One, creator of the spire and the castle that sits atop it, was likely a Runeborn, as were the ones that slew him. Apparently, Runeborn are not always around. They only appear during times of strife or great upheaval, and by all accounts are capable of wielding great power. But that does not necessarily mean they are saviors sent from on high to right wrongs. After all, as Zavir's history lesson demonstrated, some of the evils that have plagued Ptolus throughout its dark past may have been Runeborn themselves. I think as a group, we are pretty good at keeping our thoughts and facial expressions separate. Either Zavir didn't notice the concern I knew we all shared, or he simply didn't think it was worth mentioning. In recent days, we had stumbled upon no fewer than 5 Runeborn children. I wondered, if we had seen 5, how many more could potentially be out there? If their coming meant there would be calamity, did the number of them appearing correlate with the severity of the associated disaster to come? The fact that Runeborn could be the source of the trouble in the times when they appear made the situation even more unsettling. Considering the number of them that have appeared recently, something big is about to happen in the coming years. This makes the interest of the cults in the Runeborn so much more sinister. It also makes saving Linnech Cran a top priority. I already was not a fan of returning him to a father we were planning to kill. Runeborn or not, we cannot allow him to be raised by a gangster. Armed with this knowledge, we knew we needed help. We would seek the aid of the Knights of the Golden Cross. A call to our only allies. When we arrived back in Old Town, Tyrick had already filled in Kara Swanwain. Being the leader of one of the oldest organizations in Ptolus, she was well aware of the history surrounding the Runeborn. She was shocked at the appearance of yet another Runeborn child in such a short period of time and immediately offered aid. Quaylin Philistai, their elven wizard, was called in to examine Lionel. He was able to ascertain that the possession was related to the watch Lionel held on to so tightly, and somehow his life was tied to that possession. Perhaps the rumors of his death were not exaggerated after all. After pulling some strings, Kira and Quaylin were able to acquire a scroll of a powerful spell that trapped part of the boy's soul, giving him a degree of independence from the possessing entity and the watch, saving his life, for the time being. When we arrived, we were greeted by Desis and introduced to their major domo, a Naga named Tetsumi. The serpentine creature regarded us from the rafters of the old structure, but welcomed us in a gentle and cultured tone. We were ushered in to speak with Kira, who told us that while Lionel's life was no longer at risk, the entity was still there. Quaylin's magic prevented the entity from taking over, but Lionel could still hear it whispering in his mind. However, the poor kid was absolutely drained and was getting some much-needed sleep. Rena apparently had some serious maternal instincts because she had formed a nearly instantaneous bond with Lionel and refused to be separated from him. We had much more to discuss with Kira, but thought it best to wait until Ruger returned from his errand before continuing. We also needed to get back to Olaf's and retrieve the gear we had left behind because it wasn't well suited to underwater combat. Before I left, though, I had to check on Rena and Lionel for myself. We were told they were okay, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. I made my way to the room where Lionel slept and quietly opened the door. Lightning quick, Rena rolled out of the bedside chair, unsheathed her knife, and came up in a perfect fighting stance, just like we had practiced. It was pure instinct. She wasn't showing off. She was protecting the boy. I was so proud of her. Seeing that it was me, she launched herself at me and hugged me fiercely. Apparently, she had heard a little too much about the predicament we currently found ourselves in. She had already been orphaned and did not want to see another guardian die. I assured her we were all fine and not currently in any danger. The lie was so convincing, I almost believed it myself. She soon calmed down, and I asked her to keep an eye on Lionel while we ran some errands and then headed back downstairs. We got a carriage and headed down to the docks just in case anyone was on the lookout for us. While we were on the way, I had an idea. Grabbing a scrap of parchment, I began to write a note instructing the recipient to retrieve the body and kill any Balcazar found in the place. I signed it simply LC. As we neared the docks, I ducked out of the carriage and told everyone I would meet them at Olaf's. I made my way through the darkest alleys I could find and into the warrens and approached the smuggler's house. I came in slow and cautious, expecting the place to be crawling with Balcazars. I was not disappointed. I dirtied up the note and made it look worn and discarded. Sneaking as close as I dared, I dropped it near a corner of the house and stomped it into the muck, making sure enough remained visible to catch the eye of someone looking for clues about who had just knocked the place over. And with that accomplished, I got the hell out of there. Back at Olaf's. I got to Olaf's a while after the others. They had already retrieved our gear from the rooms and were talking to Olaf at the corner of the bar. He had some very interesting news for us. Some rough-looking people had come around asking about us. Again. This time they were not violent. They wanted to seem friendly. From what I had seen of Torriden and Linnech Cran's operations, the difference in tactics made sense. Torriden was a brawler. Linnech was a thinker. Though the friendly approach didn't result in any busted lips, we did not believe we were in any less danger. On the contrary, we were certain we would need to lay low until our business with Linnech Cran was concluded. Still, we didn't want to hang Olaf out to dry. He had been a great landlord, and in spite of his uncaring demeanor, he seemed to have our best interest at heart, and I'd like to think that loyalty extended beyond our history as tenants. I asked him if he had a cask or a barrel I could use as a signal should he need us. Without word, Olaf reached to the side and lifted the lid from a barrel that appeared empty. Except it wasn't. Inside was a large warhammer, I arched an eyebrow at this revelation. After he replaced the lid, I palmed my wand of alarm. A quick flick of the wrist later, I told him, "The next time you remove the lid from that barrel, we'll know, and we'll come." Ruger's disaster. We got another carriage and headed back to Old Town, but when we saw Ruger still wasn't back, we headed out again. We started toward the entrance to Rivergate, and it soon became apparent that something was amiss. There was a line of wagons and carriages backed up from the gate. We could see that they were being searched before they were allowed to enter or leave the district. We knew we needed to turn off onto another street before we got into the line and were quietly formulating plans on what to do next. Gisselfried went to sit with the driver, his hood pulled over his head so he could get a better look around while remaining as inconspicuous as possible. We hoped that, even with his face obscured, his equipment would be familiar enough to draw Ruger's attention if he were in the area. We were starting to run out of side streets when we heard a gruff voice instruct our driver to pull off onto the next street. The driver never saw who spoke, but hearing the voice, Gis told him to comply. Once we were out of sight of the street leading to Rivergate, Ruger melded out of the shadows as if they were part of him. He wasted no time climbing into the carriage, and we immediately headed back toward the headquarters of the Knights of the Golden Cross. On the way, we asked Ruger what in the hell happened. When he left, we were under the understanding that he would be going to the Cran compound to see if he could sweeten the deal for us. At least that is what he said. But in hindsight, I think he went to pick a fight, which appears to be exactly what happened. We never got all of the details, but what was clear was that Ruger had been forced to flee for his life, and had only narrowly escaped Rivergate before Cran's people sealed the district off. Oddly enough, Ruger seemed far more interested in hearing about our meeting at Castle Shard than explaining what he had done. So we filled him in. We told him about the new job, the golden statue, the 2,500 gold throne reward, the truth about Gregory Abercombe, and the possibility that the statue wasn't merely a statue at all. We explained how we had forced Castle Shard to reveal at least part of the truth and how recovering Gregory Abercombe could potentially place both Castle Shard and House Abercombe in our debt. Ruger didn't see it that way. He believed Castle Shard intended to take all the credit for the rescue while leaving us with little more than a sack of coin and a pat on the back. The more he talked about it, the more I began to see his point. If Gregory Abercombe truly could be restored, whoever accomplished that feat would gain a great deal more than 2,500 gold thrones. They would gain influence, prestige, political favors, possibly an ally among the nobility. And Castle Shard stood to gain all of that while we did the dangerous work. Ruger wasn't opposed to helping Gregory Abercombe. He simply wanted to make sure we received the credit we deserved. Eventually, we came to a compromise. If there was a way to undo whatever magic had transformed Gregory Abercombe into a golden statue, we would attempt to discover it ourselves. First, however, we needed the statue, and that meant assaulting Linnech Cran's compound. The job Castle Shard had presented as a simple retrieval mission was rapidly becoming something else entirely, something personal, something dangerous. And if Ruger's expression was any indication, he was looking forward to it. Olaf's is burning. When we got back to the headquarters of the Knights of the Golden Cross, we had our story together. We knew we'd need help raiding the compound, so we put together our argument to make it difficult for the Knights to refuse us. We told them that Cran was responsible for the production of shivel, the same drug that had been destroying lives for longer than we had even been in the city. It was difficult to deny its impact. So many street corners were occupied by people passed out with this telltale blue stains around their mouths and noses and on their fingers. We explained what we had seen: the ship, the smugglers, the sahaugin, the operation beneath the city. We were in the middle of making our pitch when a small chime went off in my head. I knew exactly what that sound meant. I interrupted the discussion by calling out, "Olaf's is under attack." The room immediately fell silent. Tyrant quickly began casting a spell and closed his eyes. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. I recognized the spell he had cast, a sending spell, allowing him to speak with someone from great distances. The seconds stretched on like hours. Then his eyes opened. He told us that Olaf said about a dozen men came in and began killing everyone and setting the place afire. He also said that it was too late and that we should not come. So we just stood in silence, knowing that our friends and roommates were being put to the sword as we stood there, knowing that the place where so many people lived was being burned to the ground, knowing that Olaf, the stubborn old bastard who had given us a place to stay when we first arrived in the city, was still there, and there was nothing we could do about it.